Good morning, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lee. I'm a real estate lawyer at Mintz, and I'm a longtime member of Boston Harbor Now's advisory board and the Policy and Planning Committee, which is the host for this morning's forum. If this is your first time joining a Harbor Use Public Forum, please note that Boston Harbor Now hosts these public meetings monthly to enable members of the public to learn more about both public and private projects happening around the waterfront. And if you're a regular attendee, thank you for joining us again this month. Boston Harbor Now is a nonprofit focused on ensuring that the waterfront and the harbor islands are increasingly climate resilient and accessible and welcoming to everyone. Our work spans a wide range of issues, ranging from commenting on waterfront development projects to planning for future ferry service, to bringing underserved communities out to experience the harbor islands. Boston Harbor Now believes strongly that the waterfront belongs to all of us, and that by bringing together interactive conversations like this, we can help ensure that the projects that are planned along the waterfront are both inclusive and resilient. Unfortunately, we anticipate remaining on the Zoom platform for the time being, with a possible hybrid forum in the summer, when we hope to continue our tradition of on-site visits. We appreciate how many people have been able to participate in this virtual format. We'd like to do a quick poll to learn who's here today, and just gauge a sense that will also help Nick Moreno, our presenter, understand the audience. So we'd like to understand your level of familiarity with the Boston Wetlands Protection Ordinance. And there's a poll up on your screen. If you could just make one choice and click submit, that will enable us to have a sense of our audience. Today, we're joined by Nick Moreno, the Executive Director of the Boston Conservation Commission, who's a Rosendale native and has an environmental science degree from BU, as well as an environmental law and policy degree from the Vermont Law School. He'll be talking with us about Boston's Wetlands Protection Ordinance. And Alice, do we have the results of that poll?
I am trying to share them. Are they on the screen now?
Yep.
Okay.
So about half of folks are new to the Wetlands Ordinance, and we've got a few experts here, folks who helped to write them, but the vast majority, or at least half the people, are here to learn about them. So Nick, if you can take it away from there, we'd appreciate it and welcome. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Alice. Super excited to be here this morning. So I have a presentation and happy to take questions throughout, take questions at the end, whatever makes the most sense for folks. Feel free to utilize the chat feature if you have a question or a comment, so you don't lose it by the time I'm done talking. So let me pull up my presentation and we can get started. So like Rebecca said, I'm here today basically to talk about the Boston's wetlands regulations, and super excited to try and get this to move. There we go. All right, so brief agenda for this morning. I'm going to give an overview for folks, just so everybody's kind of on the same baseline about how the Wetlands Ordinance is slightly different from the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act, walk through the different phases of regulations, and then leave time at the end for some discussion and questions. So as folks may or may not know, in Massachusetts, there is the Wetlands Protection Act, which protects wetlands, floodplains, etc., from basically alteration. Any activity that happens within a wetland, within a floodplain, or within 100 feet of a wetland is something that is regulated by the local Conservation Commission. And so as part of the state's home rule authority, the city's home rule authority, we are able to supplement our jurisdiction under the Wetlands Protection Act with a local wetlands ordinance, and develop procedures and protect additional resource areas for additional performance standards that are stricter than the Wetlands Protection Act. And so, oops. And so that's what the city did. we have enacted our Wetlands Protection Ordinance, which allows the Boston Conservation Commission to establish stricter standards and protect additional resource areas than under the Wetlands Protection Act. And specifically, what I'll be talking about today in phase 2, we are talking about extending protections to isolated vegetated wetlands, which are not protected at all under state law, as well as vernal pools and vernal pool habitat, which are protected to some degree under the Wetlands Protection Act, and then what is most applicable to Boston Harbor now. And its mission is the 100-year floodplain, or as you may know it, land subject to coastal storm flowage. Additionally, what this particular ordinance did, it also made climate change a major consideration for the commission. And it allowed for the creation of new flood resilient zones, new resource areas, the commission to specifically develop regulations around climate resilience as it relates to wetlands, allowing the commission to extend the riverfront area, and development and consideration of environmental justice in regulations and guidelines. And so we'll talk about all those in a little bit more detail. So where we kind of are, the ordinance was passed in December of 2019, and it was a pretty thick document with a lot of information and a lot of direction for the commission to kind of develop and effectuate all of the different components of it. And so what the commission has ultimately decided to do is to break that down into different phases to make it more digestible for folks, as opposed to a massive regulatory process that could be confusing, and pieces could fall to the wayside. So that's not what we wanted to do. So we've broken it out into phases. Phase 1 was the administrative and procedural regulations, codifying a lot of the different process and procedures that are outlined in the ordinance, trying to sync up dates and timelines with the Wetlands Protection Act so that projects can follow one unified timeline, changing or adding fees, all of that kind of clarifying process for applicants. And so those regulations were approved by the commission in August of 2020. And somewhat hot off the press from a couple of weeks ago, phase 2 was just approved by the commission. And that was really what I'm here to talk about today specifically, which was the performance standards and regulations around those 2 inland wetland resources, the isolated wetlands and the vernal pools, but also the coastal wetlands being the 100-year floodplain or land subject to coastal storm flowage. And then I will also end with a slight teaser about where we are with phase 3, which is something that is highly anticipated by a lot of folks, including the commission, being our climate resilience and environmental justice regulations and guidelines. So again, as I kind of noted, we've broken it down into different buckets, and this just kind of clarifies what's in each of those different phases. So I've already noted in terms of phase 1 was focused on administrative and procedural. Really, just codifying those requirements from the ordinance into more understandable chunks for applicants to have. And then the 3 resource areas that I'm focusing on phase 2. And then again in phase 3, which I'll touch on, really the strong focus is on climate resilience, those flood resilient zones, the extension of the riverfront area, and climate equity and environmental justice. So phase 2, what did we do in phase 2? I need to talk about it in the past tense because we've already done it. So for isolated wetlands, what we've really done is tried to mirror the performance standards and regulations on bordering vegetated wetlands. The same criteria for identifying wetland indicator species, hydric soils, etc. All of those are still applicable for isolated wetlands. The only main characteristic is that they don't border on surface waters. So these are areas that may just have naturally high groundwater, areas that may be inundated by stormwater, or a low point that may be inundated by stormwater, that have natural wetland characteristics just because of their hydrology and their topography. And so what the commission did with isolated wetlands is the commission at their discretion is allowed to permit alteration with or without replication of the resource area. But a key point too is the commission also has the authority to allow restoration of unaltered isolated wetland in lieu of or in addition to replication. So those are some significant considerations that the commission has to enhance the ecological services provided by an isolated wetland. Especially in an urban area like Boston, where a lot of our isolated area wetland resources are full of invasive species and have been, damaged over time through neglect, encroachment, or even dumping. So this is a key point in order to help restore the native plant community, as well as the ecological integrity of those resources. And then something that you'll note across all of the resource areas is that we've implemented a universal requirement as of right now for these resource areas to require applicants consider the impacts of climate change on the resource and integrate climate resilience and adaptation strategies into the project as it would impact these resources. So that's a key consideration, which will be expanded upon in phase 3 when we start getting into more widespread climate resilience considerations. For vernal pools are an immensely important resource, especially for the species that utilize them for reproduction and all of those wonderful things, because they only exist for a small time of the year. And so the commission was very, very adamant that there be no alteration to the vernal pool itself, but was cognizant that sometimes, especially again in the constraints that we have in Boston, to allow some alteration to the 100-foot buffer zone, which the commission has identified, be universally known as vernal pool habitat. Again, at their discretion with a lot of other criteria, as indicated in the regulations, to make sure that it's not, negatively impacting the vernal pool. Specifically, making sure that wildlife corridors and surface hydrology are maintained, not wanting to cut off those migration paths for amphibians and other species that use the vernal pool, and making sure that the sources of water are not eliminated that would otherwise feed the vernal pool. A key note too for vernal pools, while the commission specifically says no alteration to the pool itself, it does permit resource area enhancement, which is a defined term in the ordinance, which basically says removal of invasive species, improvement of the values and functions of the resource area itself. So if you have a degraded vernal pool, you are allowed to improve its function in order to make sure that it is providing wildlife habitat and all the other key functions that it would have. For land subject to coastal storm flowage, we've taken a two-pronged approach for how we are going to be regulating the floodplain. Really, it's broken down into areas of the floodplain that the commission would consider natural or relatively undisturbed, and those terms are further defined in the regulations, versus what the commission would consider redevelopment. A lot of Boston is, built right up to the water's edge due to historic filling, and so in a lot of instances, the commission would consider those areas redevelopment, and the redevelopment provisions in our regulations really refer back to and incorporate the redevelopment provisions of the Wetlands Protection Act regs on the waterfront area, or excuse me, the riverfront area, which has a whole definition in that section of the regulations. And so really some of the key characteristics here are for the relatively natural or undisturbed areas of the floodplain, we want to make sure that those natural functions and interests and values that those areas have are being protected, making sure that any activities within those areas are not negatively impacting other properties or other resource areas due to that alteration. As opposed to redevelopment, which we're really looking at making sure that there is an improvement over existing conditions. Stormwater standards are being followed. Climate adaptation and mitigation is being implemented. We're reducing overall, pavement, those kinds of things, improvement over existing conditions. And the key key piece here too is that the overall area which we are defining as land subject to coastal storm flowage is not necessarily changing based off of how it's defined in the Wetlands Protection Act related to the FEMA flood maps and the flood insurance studies that are performed. But what projects will need to consider is those areas that are within land subject to coastal storm flowage based off of those FEMA firm maps will need to assess what the elevation and depth of flooding will be looking out 50 years. So in 2070, the city is, by at least 2070, the city is preparing for, roughly 40 inches of sea level rise. So that's going to have an impact on the base flood elevation that we'll start seeing later on in the century. And so projects need to consider that depth of flooding today when they're coming to the commission for an order of conditions. So that they are thinking about that. They are thinking about their critical infrastructure. They are thinking about how, where the first floor or the lowest floor is located, how they're going to make sure that their property is climate and flood resistant to all of these potential impacts that they may face in the future, and not having a negative impact on the resource area or adjacent properties from the activity that's occurring today. And so just wanted to share some pictures because everybody likes to look at a picture. So I've got some pictures here for an isolated wetland. This is the Roslindale Wetland Urban Wild. It's a commission-owned property in Roslindale, one of the neighborhoods of Boston. Obviously, the commission owns this property, so it's much more protected than it otherwise would have been pre-ordinance. But again, without the ordinance in place, this entire property if it was not owned by the commission, could essentially be filled and altered without any form of review by the commission. So important that this resource is protected. Similarly, we have a vernal pool, which is a certified vernal pool by the state, located in Allendale Woods, which is kind of splits the difference between Jamaica Plain. Most of it's in West Roxbury, 2 other neighborhoods within the city. And then land subject to coastal storm flowage, which I'm sure folks are very familiar with on this call, which has a significant area within the city. We've seen historic flooding back in 2018. Again, we saw flooding with some of these past storms that we've seen, or we've had just this winter down on Long Wharf and in other parts of the city. So those areas are experiencing flooding today. So it's important that we make sure that we have these regulations on the books so we can start making sure projects are being adequately protected and these activities are being regulated much more closely now. And then a little teaser for phase 3, which again, we're very early on in the process. Boston Harbor Now and a lot of folks on this call are key stakeholders for us in getting feedback and getting input in the development of these regulations, both for phase 2 and I'm sure for phase 3. So I definitely want to, get it out there that we are thinking about this. We are working on this. We're in the weeds right now, putting our thoughts on paper, and there will be plenty of opportunity for anybody that's interested to get involved in this process, to provide feedback, to provide input. We're really excited about this process and want to make sure that everybody has that opportunity to provide that input. So in phase 3, we're really looking at the coastal flood resilience zone, which, as is defined in the ordinance, is an area beyond the current area of coastal flooding that is likely to see flooding within the next 50 years. So if folks are familiar with the coastal flood resilience overlay zoning district, you can think of that area as what would essentially be the coastal flood resilient zone. Those future flood projections done by the city, incorporated into climate ready Boston process that is likely to experience flooding due to sea level rise out into 2070. And so these are some of the questions that we're asking ourselves now, going through the mapping process, and really trying to identify what it is that we should be regulating, how we should be regulating, and how soon we should be regulating. Those are all very important questions that we're starting to ask ourselves, and certainly would value suggestions or feedback on those as we kind of work through the process. Similarly, the inland flood resilient zone is the area beyond inland flooding today. So inland flooding is either isolated land subject to flooding or bordering land subject to flooding under the Wetlands Protection Act. And so this would be areas beyond that, which would likely see an increase in flooding due to increased precipitation, extreme storm events that otherwise could not be handled by the city's stormwater infrastructure, and would cause additional flooding. So some of the same questions are being asked there. In terms of the riverfront area as a densely developed municipality, under state law, the riverfront area, which is the area that abuts perennial waterways under the Wetlands Protection Act, is set to 25 feet. So the riverfront area, which is a resource area under the act, we only have jurisdiction 25 feet from essentially mean annual high water from perennial waterways. So the ordinance goes a step beyond that. And the ordinance says that whether it's perennial or intermittent, if it's a waterway, it's protected and it has riverfront area. And then it even goes further to say the commission has the ability to identify stretches of waterway or entire waterways that it feels it should have an extended riverfront. And it leaves it up to the commission to determine how far that riverfront area should be from mean annual high water, but caps it at 200 feet from mean annual high water, which is the largest distance that is cited in the Wetlands Protection Act. And so we're having some mapping done right now. We're identifying all the perennial intermittent waterways. We're determining what land uses, what's the infrastructure, what roads exist within all of these different distances from these waterways, and then thinking about what kind of criteria makes sense to be used in order for us to, in an objective way, determine how the riverfront area should be extended in any given instance. And so that's kind of where we're going now with the extension of the riverfront area. And so if this wasn't all enough, we're also focusing on climate resilience and environmental justice. So as defined in the ordinance requires that the commission consider sea level rise, extreme heat, precipitation, storm events, and drought in its decisions as it pertains to the impacts of climate change on a project, and can condition work appropriately. And so we're trying to really think through how we're going to look at this in a more holistic way that would apply to all resource areas that would be subject to the ordinance. So a lot of considerations there to think about, and how we can both qualitatively and quantitatively assess those impacts, and have performance standards that would be universally applicable to coastal bank as well as isolated vegetated wetlands. So really thinking that through, and we'll get into the filing guide where we start to address or start to play around with some of those considerations in a second. And then the other key component of this phase of regulations is environmental justice. And so we are really looking at developing guidelines, regulations that are promoting climate equity and environmental justice, not just from a procedural standpoint, making our process more equitable, making access to the commission and its decisions more equitable, but also in a substantive way. And we're still trying to figure out what that means. I think, even though MEPA has issued guidance and protocols through the EJ lens, it's still not 100%, substantive. So really thinking through how we can tailor this to the local level, how we can tailor these to our local environmental justice populations, and how we can best incorporate those in the wetlands protection sphere. And then Very quickly touching on our filing guidelines. So we've always had a published list of filing guidelines on our website. And so we have updated our filing guidelines to specifically start to address and start to get information and data points for us to help formulate those climate resiliency regulations. And specifically wanted to note that, we are talking about folks doing a consideration of sea level rise and other coastal flooding, looking at specifically the projections of sea level rise and the depth of flooding that we are expected to have given sea level rise, looking at the Climate Ready Boston report, as well as the district and neighborhood scale solution reports. What's been identified? Are you in a flood pathway? How are you making sure that your property is being resilient? Answering some of those questions is something that is very important to the commission, so we can start to make sure that people are incorporating these solutions or at least a similar level of protection that the city has identified as something that would be needed in that specific location. Similarly, we're asking folks to consider how their project is incorporating changes in precipitation or stormwater flooding. So if you're not familiar, the Boston Water and Sewer Commission has an inundation viewer. It's a new inundation model that basically models stormwater as it flows through their infrastructure in several different storm events. And it shows areas where they're projecting in future storm events, there may be stormwater flooding throughout the city. And it's a really neat tool. If you haven't checked it out, highly recommend you check it out. There are a lot of little dots across the city that you could kind of drop yourself into street view and kind of see where the water would be as it relates to the surrounding buildings and sidewalks. And it's a really neat tool. And so we're making sure folks are considering not only coastal flooding, but also stormwater flooding, making sure that water is going into the ground, not into our infrastructure, infiltration, green infrastructure, environmentally site-sensitive design, those kinds of things. And we also have a consideration of extreme heat. And when we're starting to think about extreme heat and its impacts to the resource areas, we're talking about changes in surface cover, impervious to pervious or vice versa, total vegetation on your site, pre and post, incorporation of trees, etc. So we're really thinking about how all of those could impact the wetland resource areas in a more quantitative way, so that we can start to understand how sites and how projects are looking at this and get some quantitative data and some metrics that we can use to think through how we're going to go about making sure that projects are not exacerbating the heat impacts that we're already seeing, especially within the last decade is like the hottest decade ever. So like we can probably expect that to continue this summer. And so really that's all I had. So I appreciate you taking time out of your day this morning to listen to me ramble about, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Alice, you are handling the questions? We have one, we have a couple of them in the chat.
Yeah, do you want to kick things? Do you have any questions to start, Rebecca?
No, I don't think so.
Great.
So we have a question from another Rebecca. Curious about wetlands that may have been, will be created due to land use change. Does the ordinance distinguish between historical and new wetlands?
That's a good question. And then we actually got that question at our last hearing where we actually approved the regulations, and the regulations as written do not necessarily distinguish between historical versus new, but basically say any area that meets these definitional criteria is considered a wetland at any given point in time. So whether it's a historic wetland that meets those criteria, or it's a wetland that forms because of increases in precipitation, or that a wetland that migrates, or a wetland that's been purposefully created for replication or any other instance, if it meets the definitional criteria at any given time, then it is officially a protected resource.
We have another question from Josh Altador from the Boston Parks Department. Speaking about vegetation and green infrastructure, do we have any native plants currently in the wetlands?
Yes, we do. We do have a lot of native species in various wetlands across the city. I think the biggest threat to making sure that we keep native species is all the invasive species. And that is they become they're much more pervasive and much more aggressive than some of the native species and are very easily taking over a lot of wetlands. And so, where the commission is at least doing for our properties, we're investing capital dollars to make sure these areas are restored and native species are put in and invasive species are removed, and trying to restore that ecological integrity of those areas. And I think the second point there too is making sure that we aren't creating any instances where invasive species have an opportunity to take root and thrive where they aren't currently there. And so that's, damage to an area through dumping, or damage to an area through encroachment and conversion of wetland or buffer zone from a native state to, lawn or open soil. So though that's another critical piece in maintaining our native plant community.
Great. How do the regulations apply when wetlands are shared between the city and another city, Boston and Brookline, Boston and Cambridge? I guess the Muddy River project is a great example of that.
Yeah, so the ordinance is specific to land within the city of Boston. We can only locally regulate land that is within our municipal boundary. Just like Brookline has their own local bylaw, wetlands bylaw, and they can only apply their wetlands bylaw to land within the town of Brookline. So in that particular instance, these regulations and our ordinance is only applicable to land within Boston. That being said, we have a really good relationship with our colleagues, and whether in Cambridge, Newton, Brookline, we have a really good relationship with those folks, and we are always making sure that we are looking at things in a very similar lens, especially when a project like the Muddy River project has to obtain permits in multiple municipalities, and making sure that whatever it is that one municipality is requiring, the other one is also making sure that they are requiring, or as close to as possible in those instances, so that it's very clear to the applicant what their obligations are under both the Wetlands Protection Act and any individual town or city regulations.
So there's actually a follow-on related question in the chat, which is a question about assessing the compatibility of regulations in, say, Quincy or Milton and Brookline. And I will editorialize and say that I assume that in promulgating the regulations, the commission staff has in fact examined good precedents in other localities. So do you want to speak to that question with respect to our neighboring municipalities, but also generally?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The first key part of this whole regulation development process was inventorying all the municipalities in the Commonwealth that have regulations for these three resource areas. And it's fewer than you probably think. And basically assessing the overall level at which they are protective of those resource areas. They fall into generalized buckets of, you need a permit, but we're going to allow pretty much everything, to you need a permit, we're going to protect some things, and you need a permit and it's going to be a really high bar for you to overcome any kind of alteration. So it kind of falls into varying levels of degree of regulation across municipalities. And that was something that we did very early on in the process, was go and look at what everybody else had done in this space. A lot of good work has gone into this over time in a lot of municipalities. And so in a lot of ways, Boston's a little late to the game. And so we're playing catch up a little bit. So using the good ideas and the work that's already been done in other municipalities, making sure that we are pulling in their best practices, their lessons learned, was critical in developing what we've done.
there's a question on a different subject. Can you, someone has asked that you speak briefly to the commission's proactive role in land protection and acquisition for conservation, which is complementary to its role in regulating resource protection for development sites?
Yeah, so the commission is always evaluating what properties the city already has in its inventory. So a lot of the land that we already have as conservation land, whether it's Roslindale Wetlands, whether it's the Mattahunt Woods, Urban Wild, those are lands that were already held by a different department within the city. And it made sense for the commission to take ownership of those lands to protect them for conservation as undeveloped land. That was something that has been really led by the public and by the community to make sure that these lands are protected as permanent open space and undeveloped. And so that's been our main priority in getting land and acquiring land, has been through, what land does the city already have? What does, where does it make sense for the commission to take ownership of those parcels? That's been our easiest way of acquiring land, especially in Boston. Land prices are very high. And the commission does not necessarily have an infinite budget to go around and purchase property. So that has been the main route that the commission is protecting land where it makes sense to protect land and is feasible for the commission to easily do so.
Okay, I think I've gotten everybody's questions in the chat. Alice, do you see any others?
Yeah, there was one question about whether wetlands were protected under the Clean Water Act as well.
So short answer is yes and no. I think anybody that's gotten into the weeds of the Clean Water Act and the whole waters of the United States debate as it changes from one administration to the next administration would agree that that's a very muddy topic. So in some instances, yes, it's very clear that a wetland does fall under the protection of the Clean Water Act. Any navigable waterway, absolutely. In a lot of instances, especially when we're talking about isolated wetlands and vernal pools, the answer would be no. I would say probably the answer would likely be a no. It's not protected under the Clean Water Act, which is something that makes the Wetlands Protection Act in Massachusetts, as well as these local regulations, really important to protect these spaces because they would likely not be considered federally jurisdictional.
And then I had a question. You talked about the land subject to coastal storm flowage in its natural state. What happens when it's not in its natural state? How do you address, like, get a picture of Long Wharf up along with that? How does this regulation work with a place like Long Wharf that's in that coastal storm flowage area?
Yeah, so that's when we would be applying the redevelopment performance standards that we've drafted in our regulations. And so that's when we start looking at improvements over existing condition. We're talking about, overall pervious versus impervious surface cover. We're talking about how you're managing stormwater. We're talking about how you can implement adaptation or mitigation for sea level rise and all of those components. Maintaining things in the status quo just isn't good enough anymore. Obviously, if it's a minor repair project or addressing a smaller component of a site that would otherwise be redevelopment, then I think that's a different beast altogether. But if we're talking about like a major redevelopment of an area that's like Long Wharf, as an example, I don't see people redeveloping Long Wharf, but if Long Wharf was to be redeveloped into, something else, we would want to see an improvement over existing conditions there, making sure that all of the impacts of climate change are being considered in that future project.
You'd want more permeable surfaces, higher elevations.
Exactly.
Great. There's another question that came in the chat. What kind of long-term monitoring is required under the ordinance, and how long does it extend for?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and one that actually wasn't covered in my presentation, but I appreciate that question, Rebecca, because the commission also in this phase 2 of regulations of their own volition, decided they were going to put down replication and restoration requirements in the regulation. So that is a separate section that the commission has adopted that starts to address just that, making sure that this is not an afterthought of we're going to go do our project. We'll do a little bit of, restoration or replication, and then, hopefully it survives. And if not, oh well. That's not the intention of the point of allowing that kind of work to take place. And so it really elevates just that of we want to make sure this is established. If it is not established, you're going to go back and you're going to do it right. And you're going to make sure it gets established, and establishing some of those criteria in the regulations itself. Ultimately, a lot of the monitoring is at the discretion of the commission. Usually the commission imposes a 3-year monitoring after the vegetation has been established, so that, the vegetation goes in, it's established, you monitor for 3 years after that point, to make sure that, invasive species aren't popping up or plantings aren't failing, or, whatever the issues might be, that they are addressed, and that at least 75% of those plantings are surviving after those 3 years before the commission will agree that you've been successful. And of course, if the commission feels that you haven't been successful, then they can make you keep going and doing some more monitoring after that, until you have been successful in replicating or restoring the area, which was the condition on which the permit was issued.
Rebecca says thank you. We also got a thank you from Anne for the work you do and the urgency and competence that are both essential to the work. I guess I have another question, Nick, in terms of building on your previous topic. For people who aren't as familiar with the commission, at what points in the process, in different development processes, does the Conservation Commission weigh in? Do people come before you just once? Can you talk a little bit more about sort of the general work you do and like where in a process you guys fit in?
Yeah, so there's really no defined point per se in the Wetlands Protection Act or the ordinance that says you have to come to us at this given point in your project. There is a provision in the ordinance and in the Wetlands Protection Act that says, you need to have either obtained or, applied for permits that are that you are reasonably able to at the given point at which you come to the commission. And so, we do ask people, what permits do you need? What permits have you applied for? Where are you with all of these other approvals, et cetera, when they do come to us? And, we want to make sure that at least this commission, this group of individuals that sits on the commission wants to make sure that projects aren't both too early in the process, but also not too late in the process. We don't want to, because the commission ultimately doesn't want to approve something that has to then see a major project change and has, even more impacts to the resource areas first, and then they need to either come back with an amendment or with a new application to begin with, but also not too late in the process to make sure that they are complying with the commission's regulations and don't have to then retroactively go back and get all of their other approvals amended. So there is a sweet spot for projects. In terms of people reaching out to us, we have a good relationship with the folks up in the Boston Planning and Development Agency. As projects are going through Article 80, whether small or large projects review, they are being flagged for the commission, and comments are being provided to BPDA staff at that point based off of an initial review. There are sometimes scoping sessions. Anybody familiar with the Article 80 process knows that there are scoping sessions, and we, as we have capacity, will attend those and weigh in on projects at that point in time. Often, what you'll see though is projects that are starting the Article 80 process may not have all of their wetlands delineated. So it's kind of hard for the commission to provide, substantive feedback when we don't actually know what the overall impacts are to the resource areas that we're protecting. Conversely, the commission has a policy that any project that is required to comply with MIPA must obtain the secretary's certificate before you can file a notice of intent. A lot of what the whole point of MIPA is for comments to be provided by these expert agencies that are then addressed through permitting. And if you're coming to us while you still don't have all those comments in hand, how, as a permitting agency, can we make sure those comments are being addressed? So that is a policy that the commission has. So if you would need to go through MIPA, you got to go through MIPA, get your certificate, and then come to us. But aside from that, there's really no like straight or clear path for when you need to get in touch, when you don't need to get in touch. But a lot of folks do reach out ahead of filing to, have initial conversations or get an initial review, which I think is helpful for everybody in the long run.
And for those of you on this call who don't know about the Conservation Commission hearings, they are every other Tuesday at 6 o'clock. I've just put a link in the chat to those upcoming dates if learning more about the Conservation Commission is something you would like to do. Also in the chat up above, Rebecca put in a link to learn more about the wetlands regulations overall. And when Nick was talking about it, I added the link to the Boston Water and Sewer Commission's storm water viewer, which, as Nick noted, is a really fun way to see. Most maps just show you something will get wet in a storm, and they try to show you how much water will be there. There's a big difference between having 6 inches of flood water and having 6 feet of flood water, and most of the map viewers available in Boston don't distinguish super well between the two. So the Boston Water and Sewer Commission did a really good job with that tool. We'll give you just a moment to pause, and if there are any other questions. I will say that we have yet to finalize our March speaker for our next forum, but we do hope to have a forum in March, and we do have confirmation for someone in April. So you can follow along with bostonharbornow.org on our website. You can sign up for our monthly email updates, which usually provides this kind of information. And as always, you can follow us on social media. We have a great content creator who has stuff on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and probably LinkedIn, although that's not a platform that I am following as closely, but you can follow us across many social media platforms, and we hope that you do. We have one more question in the chat. Can you discuss future flood conditions and climate change impacts, how they're presented and assessed with land subject to coastal storm flowage? Are there standard guidelines or assessments utilized by developers or private landowners?
Yes, I want to make sure that I understand the question. So yes, so what we are essentially asking folks to do in current land subject to coastal storm flowage, as an example, if your property is, within the floodplain and has a base flood elevation or a level of flooding at, let's just say 10 feet, NAVD 88. What we're going to be looking for you when you come in is we're going to ask you to assess what the future flood conditions of your project site are going to be in 2070. And so we're expecting 40 inches of sea level rise on or before 2070 within the city. So real easy way is to take your NAVD 88 and then add 40 inches. And then that will be what we are looking at in terms of your overall amount of flooding at your property in 2070. And so a really great tool that kind of already does this for you is the BPDA zoning viewer. So if you go into the BPDA zoning viewer and add the sea level rise layer to it, and you can go to any property and you can click on it and it will show the sea level rise base flood elevation, and then we'll walk you through on how to come up with your design flood elevation for your project property. So that's a tool that the city already has for you to use in thinking about how you're going to be looking at what is my flood elevation going to be in 2070. The BPDA has already kind of taken that initial step, so you can use that tool as a baseline for your considerations before the commission. And additionally, on top of that, in terms of standards and guidelines or assessments, we're really pointing people to what Climate Ready is saying. those neighborhoods district solution reports. I think we'll have one for each neighborhood once the East Boston and Charlestown Phase 2 reports come out. Are really helpful and really great resources to rely on, where it shows, you can be able to find where your property is within the floodplain, and it'll tell you, based off of, our assessment, these are the potential options that have been identified as solutions that you can implement to make your property or the whole neighborhood district more resilient. So making sure that you're not precluding future implementation and incorporating that information now really helps both, I think, the proponent and the commission to assess how a project has considered those impacts.
Thanks, Nick, and thank you for presenting today. Thank you, Rebecca, for being our official host. We got a thank you from Sarah McCammon in the chat, and thank you to everyone who was able to join us this morning. Stay well. Thanks for caring about Boston's waterfronts and wetlands, and we hope to see you at our future webinar and out on the waterfront. Have a great day.